Hey, podcast friends. This is Dr. Steve Hewlett with the podcast Simple Healthy Choices for Weight Loss, where every week we help people who have realized that as their health has been declining over the years, the number of medications they are being prescribed is increasing. We want to help you reverse this health path so you can live the vibrant, pain-free, and hopefully medication-free life you deserve to live. If you'd like even more information on this topic, you can go to Amazon or Audible and pick up my book, Your Plate is Your Fate. And if you think my book helps you on your new health path, please tell your friends and leave a review where you purchased it. Hey, podcast listeners. Thank you so much for coming back to another podcast. And in today's podcast, what I want to talk to you is I want to clear up some extremely horrible misinformation that we have been given over the last several decades. And this information we've been given is actually causing extreme amounts of disease in our population. And this is occurring all over the world for the same bad information that we've given. So today, what I'm talking about is the history of processed food. Where did this come about in the first place? Where did this come about that we said that eating good, healthy dietary fat is what makes us fat? So that's what I wanted to explain today. So in order to start this, we're going to have to go all the way back to 1955, because in 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack. Now, this may not seem like a big deal now, but back then this was huge because people didn't have heart attacks back then like we have now. We're having heart attacks all the time anymore, and I'm sure you probably know somebody who's actually had a heart attack and very possibly died from one. But back in 1955, this wasn't a very common thing. And that alone should tell you that there's something major that has changed from then until now. So once President Eisenhower had a heart attack, everybody was trying to figure out what causes heart attacks. And there were two main people that came into play on this. There was John Yudkin and there was Ancel Keys. Now, John Yudkin, he was a British physiologist and nutritionist. And back in 1964, he had done a lot of studies and found out that sugar is what raises your serum triglyceride levels and raises your insulin levels. And that by raising your triglyceride and insulin levels by sugar, this can lead to heart disease, diabetes, gastrointestinal disease, eye disease, and inflammatory diseases. And at that time, in 1972, he published a book called Pure, White, and Deadly. And this is a fantastic book. This kind of started a big craze right now. I've read it, I've got it, and I would highly recommend you getting it. So again, it's John Yudkin, and it's called Pure, White, and Deadly. And he said sugar is what is the basis of all of our problems. However, there was another person by the name of Ancel Keys. And Ancel Keys was a Minnesota epidemiologist. And Ancel Keys was very, very persuasive person. He had a very persuasive attitude, and this really helped him get his beliefs put above John Yudkin's. Now, Ancel Keys was actually the inventor of the K rations back in World War II, where we fed all of our soldiers. Now, in 1952, Ancel Keys took a sabbatical to England, and in his sabbatical, he was looking at obesity and the cardiovascular disease and nutrition. And in 1958, he launched his infamous long-term observational study of diet and heart disease. And this was called the 7 Countries Study. Now, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but actually this started off as a 22-country study, but he only found 7 of those countries that actually met his model. So he changed it from 22-country study to a 7-country study. And in this study, what he said that, and again, this was just an observational study, but he said that cholesterol levels predict heart disease. And he said the amount of saturated fats in diet predict cholesterol levels. And he said that you need to prefer your vegetables and vegetable oils to solid fats. And he wants you to keep your total fat intake under 30% of your total caloric intake. But this was important because by decreasing the percent of calories that come from fat, that means you had to increase the percent of calories that come from carbohydrates. And we'll see in just a little bit what that did to us. And since that time, there have been multiple studies that have shown all the different flaws with this study. But as you'll see later, this study still became very important in what actually got publicized and what got put into our dietary guidelines. So some of the flaws of this study from Ancel Keys, one, like I already said, he left out 15 countries that did not show what he was wanting to show. So that's why it went from a 22 country down to a 7 country study. He left out all the indigenous tribes, like the Inuit of North America. These Inuit eat nothing but animal meat and animal fat. And these Inuit had the lowest prevalence of heart disease in the entire planet, okay, just by eating animal meat and animal fat. He also didn't take into account the fact that trans fats and the popularization of margarine over butter was a big deal at that time. Back then, this was when they were touting, saying that trans fats were great. So they would take these unsaturated fats, bubble hydrogen through them, to turn them from a liquid fat into a solid fat. And that's why it's called a trans fat, because they were thinking that solid fats were good for you, which now we found out it has nothing to do whether it's saturated, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, or if it's just plain saturated fats. It just depends on where the fat comes from and the chemical processing that goes to get those fats. And then the other thing that he flaw of this study was that he stated that Japan and Italy had the least fat intake and they had the least cardiovascular disease. However, he left out the fact that Japan and Italy also had the least sugar intake of all these other countries. So these were just some of the flaws, and there's other flaws of this. But remember, this was a correlational study. And the best way to describe the difference between a correlational study and a causational study, okay, so whether something just correlated to it or whether it actually causes it. And the best way that I found to explain this is the way I'd learned about it a long time ago when I was in college with my first degree. And back then, there was a study that was done that showed that the more ice cream sales there were in a month, the more drownings there were. So you have to look at this and say, does that mean that the more people who consume ice cream also have a failure in the ability to swim? No, of course not. That just means that both swimming, boating, whatever, that correlates with ice cream intake because it's warm weather. So in the summer, your ice cream sales are going to go up, but so is the amount of people that are in the water, so they increase drownings. It's not that one caused the other. It wasn't causational. It was just a correlation because they both had the same reason for being elevated. And this is extremely important because that's exactly what we found out is going on with high cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease. It's not the high cholesterol levels. It's what's causing the high cholesterol levels and what's causing the heart disease. And I've talked about this in some other podcasts as well. So if you go back to my podcast, episode 8 of how excessive carbohydrate intake causes organ failure, or you can go back to episode 9 where I talk about this is as simple as it gets. And I just break down exactly how simple it is. The problems we have right now that's causing all of our cardiovascular disease, our type 2 diabetes, our obesity, our metabolic syndrome, everything else, how it really is. It's not an easy fix, but it is a very simple thing. You just have to change your nutrition. But anyway, so that's how this all started. It started with President Eisenhower having a heart attack, and then John Yuckin and Ancel Keys going out and saying why they thought that this was the reason for the heart attack, and then all the flaws of the study. So now, like Paul Harvey says, and now for the rest of the story. So after these studies were done, back in 1973, President Nixon was running for another term in office. And he wanted to make sure that the cost of food was not going to be on the political campaign. So he wanted to make sure that food was very cheap and affordable. And so what he did was he put a person the Secretary of Agriculture, which was Senator Earl Rusty Butz, he put him in charge of this to find out how can we make food really, really cheap. So this is when Senator Butz looked around and he found that there's a man in Japan that just came up with high fructose corn syrup. And this was wonderful because before this, high fructose or sugar came from either beet sugar or from cane sugar. And now we can actually make sugar out of corn, which was great because we produce corn right here in the United States also. So it was very easy to grow. It was very, very cheap, and it can make the prices very, very low. However, at that time, we had no idea all the horrible things that happens with fructose. And if you want to know about that, again, you can go back to my podcast, episode 6 of What is Fructose and Why is it Poison? But this was a major thing. Now, high fructose corn syrup is exactly the same thing as table sugar, which is sucralose. The only difference is with sucralose, which is your table sugar, like you normally think about it, it's 50% glucose and 50% fructose. However, with high fructose corn syrup, there's just a little bit more fructose than there is the glucose. Now, they tell you that this is a good thing because this ranks low on the glycemic index and it doesn't raise your insulin. But as you'll see in those episodes that I just told you about, neither of these things have anything to do with why fructose is poison. But anyway, again, you can go back to episode 6 if you want to learn more about that. But again, this was back in 1973. Well, now let's jump forward to 1977. And in 1977, Senator McGovern was tasked with coming up with the new dietary guidelines for the United States. And this is when they come up with the 1977 McGovern Commission Edict. And this is where the new dietary guidelines came from. Well, McGovern, obviously, he didn't know. He's a senator. He didn't know anything about this. So what he did was he put the labor reporter, Nick Modern, in charge. Nick Modern had no scientific background whatsoever. So what he did was he looked around and he relied all his information on a nutritionist from the Harvard School of Public Health by the name of Mark Hegsted. Now, Mark Hegsted also did no studies of his own. You know what Mark Hegsted did? He referred all the way back to the 1958 7-country study by Ancel Keys. So our whole dietary guidelines were rewritten because of a study that was done in 1958 that was extremely flawed in the way it was done. It was only a correlational study, but because of this, we wrote up our new dietary guidelines back in 1977. And this is why, if you listen to all my podcasts, I always say that this started in 1977. So even though there were some dates before that, 1977 was when our guidelines were actually written. And this became horrible. And that's what I want to explain to you now. Because right after this McGovern Commission edict, now we had an extremely sad series of unfortunate events. Because once he wrote these guidelines that were put together basically by Ancel Keys' 7-country studies, quote unquote, now the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, upheld this. It was also upheld by the American Heart Association, and it was also upheld by the American Society of Clinical Nutrition. All these people came together and they decided that this was going to be our new guidelines. We had to tell everybody that fat is what's making you fat. We need to get fat out of everything. And what they did was when they took the fat out, they put the sugar in. So after they got these guidelines, the government told all the food manufacturers that they need to do 5 things. They need to make massive amounts of food in order to feed our growing population. This food had to have a long shelf life because it needed to be able to stay on the shelf and be there for people to come and buy. So you don't want something that's going to be going rancid on you. And then they also need to be able to be frozen so they could transport that across the country and to other countries. And again, it needs to be really cheap. Everybody needed to afford this. And they had to increase or make it where there's no fat in their products. And that is exactly what the food companies did. So again, this didn't start off bad. They weren't trying to be mean. They weren't trying to do anything wrong. It's just that what's happened is now we know it's wrong, but they've gone so far into it that nobody is wanting to take this back, because we were able to make large, massive amounts of food. And in order to increase the long shelf life, this is where they had to take out the fat because fat gets rancid. But as you've seen or heard in my podcast, that's good. That's the kind of food that we should be eating, the kind that's going to rot, the living, the God-made food. That's actually what's most nutritious for our body, not all this chemical laden. So in order to make this long shelf life, that's where they put in these trans fats. And that's where they also started doing all the vegetable oils and the seed oils, which are extremely toxic and inflammatory to your body. But it's very, very cheap for them to make it. So again, they were keeping the cost down and they were putting these bad oils that they didn't know at that time how much inflammation and how toxic these were. But now we do know that, and they're continuously putting these kind of oils in there because it's cheap. The other thing is they had to take out all the fiber because when you freeze food that has a lot of fiber in it, if you've ever put lettuce or some kind of vegetable in the freezer and then got it out later, it tastes horrible. And that's because fiber cannot be frozen. So when they take out the fiber and they take out the fat, so now it can be made very easily. It can also be made for cheap. It has a long half-life, and it can be shipped by being frozen. The other thing that's going to make this cheap is by putting in the high fructose corn syrup, like we said earlier. Now we know how cheap that is. And again, it's a business. The food manufacturers are out there to try to make money. That's their job. That does not mean that you have to eat this stuff. But again, now it has a long shelf life. It can be frozen and transported. It's cheap with the high fructose corn syrup and also the vegetable and seed oils. And they took out the fat. And this is what the problem is, because when they take out of the fiber and they take out all the fat, they also take out the flavor. And this is where the high fructose corn syrup came in, because it can put that flavor back in there. And even worse, if you listen back to my podcast on sugar and how we're addicted to sugar, but that's what's ended up happening is they put in a substitute that makes it not only taste good, but makes it taste great and also makes you want to keep coming back for more and more and more until we're totally addicted to sugar. So what did all this happen? Why is this a big deal? Okay. The reason this is a big deal is you have to look at what's happened since that time. And back in 1958, the CDC said that there were only 500,000 people that had diabetes in the United States. 500,000. And at that time, the majority of it was type 1. And this was in 1958. So now let's fast forward all the way to 2015. And according to CDC, now in 2015, that number has grown from 500,000 people, who is mostly type 1, to over 30 million people. And now they're saying 90 to 95% of these people with diabetes, it's type 2 diabetes, which means it's all because of what they eat. Type 2 diabetes is a nutritional disease. You can't cure it with medication. The only way you're going to treat a nutritional disease is by changing your nutrition. And that's what all my podcasts are trying to get across to you. So in 1958, we had 500,000 people with type 1 diabetes, or mostly. To 2015, we have 30 million people, and most of these are type 2 diabetes. And now when you go to 2021, that number has gone up to around 34 million people. So this is not an old problem. This is a problem that keeps getting worse and worse every single year. Every single year, we're having more and more people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And I've already talked in my other podcasts about how important this is, because type 2 diabetes basically means that you're killing every single organ in your body. Every single organ in your body can be affected by type 2 diabetes. Now, also, these numbers, these are only the numbers for people who were over 18 years old. But there was also an NHANES study, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study. This is a study that was done, and it looked at the pediatric population and looked at the nutrition. And what they found out is that in our pediatric population, all the way back from the very, very, very beginning of time, all the way up to 1980, our overall obesity rates in our pediatric patients was only 5%. However, over the next 35 years, since the new dietary guidelines came out, this has changed a lot. So now, in our 2 to 5 year old Okay, 2 to 5 year old patients, that number has doubled. It's gone from 5% that used to be obese to 13.9% that's obese now. And in our 6 to 11 year old population, it's tripled. It used to be 6.8%, and now it's gone up to 18.4% of our 6 to 11 year old patients are obese. And this is clinical obesity. And then when you look at our patients 12 to 19 years old, it has quadrupled. What used to be 5% from the beginning of time all the way up to 1980, it was only 5%. Now our 12 to 19 year olds, 20.6% of this population is considered clinically obese. So to kind of put this into a little bit of numbers, think of this as in your graduating class. If you graduated back in 1980, and say you had 500 kids in your class, of those 500 kids, only about 25 would be considered clinically obese. But in 2015, for that same 500 kids, now instead of only 25 kids being obese, now you have 100 of these kids are clinically obese. So this is no little thing. The history of where our dietary guidelines came from was a true eye-opener to me when I started looking into this, and it makes so much sense. And remember, they didn't start off doing this. They started off doing this with very, very good intentions. They wanted to make our food cheap. They wanted to make massive amounts. They wanted to keep it on the grocery store. They wanted to be able to transport it. However, now that we see all the problems with this huge amount of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, vegetable oils, seed oils, processed carbohydrates with all its chemical laden things in all these boxes, bottles, bags, and cans. And you have the artificial sweeteners, you have artificial coloring, you have artificial flavors. It's all chemicals that we're putting in our body, and this stuff is killing us. So again, like I've said all the way, the answer is simple. The simple answer is quit eating things in boxes, bottles, and cans. You've got to start eating real food, real meat, real fruit, real vegetables, full whole fat dairy. Those are the things you need to eat and stay away from all the other stuff. And I've already had a podcast on ingredient labels, but whenever you have an ingredient list that's longer than like 3 ingredients, chances are that's something you don't want to put in your face. So anyway, that's all it for now. I'm not going to carry this on, but I just wanted you to know where our dietary guidelines came from and what those dietary guidelines are doing to us and what you can do to change yourself, change your health, improve your health. Do not be relying on a medication for any of this stuff, because medications do not cure anything. When you're taking medication for glucose, when you're taking for blood pressure, when you're taking for cholesterol, these medications don't cure any of those things. All they do is block the symptoms. It's like putting a Band-Aid on it. The only way you're going to cure these conditions is change the type of food that you eat. So that's all I wanted to end with you today. And again, I want to thank you so much for listening, and have a great week. And remember, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button below and be sure to tell someone else who may want to change their health path as well. And don't forget, you can also purchase my book, Your Plate is Your Fate, on Amazon or Audible. And if you do, please leave a review.